They called him the Statue of Manhattan. For 10 years, the most ruthless billionaire in the underground, Min Ho, hadn't felt a single flicker of emotion. Not when he took his throne, and not when he crushed his enemies. He was a man who had buried his heart in the same grave as his father. But then, the heavy iron doors of his private sanctuary burst open. Standing there was a woman who didn't belong in his world, Zionne Vance, covered in the rain of a Chelsea storm, wearing a tattered silk gown from a night of betrayal, holding a stolen blade to her own throat. She didn't beg for mercy. She looked him in the eye and said, "Make me your ghost, or I'll make sure the world knows your secret." And for the first time in a decade, the man who couldn't feel laughed. That laugh was the start of a war. If you're watching this while your own potential is being ignored by people who don't deserve you, prove you're ready for more. Comment your location below so we know where our global empire is rising. Subscribing to my Afro-Korean boss stories is the first step to claiming your crown. If you choose to stay a spectator, tell us why in the comments. The humid air of the Buckhead rooftop bar didn't just feel heavy, it felt like a burial. "Let's be honest, Zionne," Preston Sterling's voice boomed, cutting through the smooth jazz and the clinking of expensive crystal. The New South Gala was in full swing, a sea of linen suits and designer cocktail dresses, but the centre of the room had suddenly become a vacuum. "You were a placeholder, a charity case. You're like last year's luxury leftovers, overused and, frankly, trash." Zionne stood perfectly still. The condensation on her glass of neat bourbon mirrored the cold sweat she refused to let break on her skin. She didn't look at the crowd of socialites who had suddenly gone silent, their eyes gleaming with the predatory hunger of the bored elite. She looked at Preston. He looked expensive. Armani suit, a Patek Philippe gleaming on his wrist, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile she had helped build. She had spent 2 years of late nights over spreadsheets, fixing his botched acquisitions and navigating the shark-infested waters of Atlanta real estate. She had been his shadow, his strategist, and his secret weapon. And now he was discarding her like a used napkin at a 5-star dinner. "I need a woman who adds value to my brand," Preston continued, his laughter a jagged, ugly sound that invited the room to join in. "Not a girl from the Southside who still thinks a gold hoop is a personality trait. You're dismissed, Zionne. Go back to the gutter. I'm sure there's a desk job at a trucking company waiting for you." A few people snickered. The woman standing next to Preston, a blonde with a face tight from recent injections, smirked and tucked her hair behind her ear. Zionne felt the sting, the hot, sharp needle of public humiliation, but she didn't cry. She didn't throw the bourbon in his face. To do so would be to give him the angry Southside girl stereotype he so desperately wanted to label her with. Instead, she adjusted her vintage silk wrap, the fabric smooth and cool against her skin, and looked past his shoulder. She wasn't looking at the exit. She was looking at the elevator. Standing there was a man who looked like he had been carved out of obsidian. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Preston's entire wardrobe, and his presence felt like a sudden drop in temperature. This was Kang Dae. To the people in this room, he was a ghost, a rumour whispered by the men who controlled the shipping ports in Savannah. To Zionne, he was the first link in a chain she had spent her life trying to ignore. Zionne locked eyes with him. In the dim amber light of the rooftop, she saw the faint inclination of his head, a microscopic nod, a recognition of the bloodline she had tried to bury. "Is that it, Preston?" Zionne asked. Her voice was low, steady, and lacked the tremor of a victim. It carried a resonance that made the socialites' laughter die in their throats. Preston blinked, surprised by her lack of tears. "Yeah, that's it. Get out." Zionne placed her drink on the edge of a mahogany table. She didn't reach for her purse. She didn't reach for the phone that sat next to it, the phone that contained the encrypted files of every illegal kickback Preston had ever paid. She didn't need them. Not tonight. "You're right about one thing, Preston," she said, stepping closer until she could smell the expensive cologne he used to mask his mediocre soul. "I don't belong here. I've been playing in a sandbox when I should have been ruling the shore." She turned and walked toward the elevator. The crowd parted for her, not out of respect, but out of a sudden, inexplicable fear. As she reached the doors, Kang Dai stepped aside, his hand ghosting over the hilt of something hidden beneath his jacket. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed her with a reverence that would have made Preston's blood run cold if he were smart enough to notice. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing out the sound of the Buckhead Gala. In the silence of the descending car, Zionne let out a single shaky breath. She looked at her reflection in the polished brass. The gold hoops he had mocked were still there, shining like halos. "It's time," she whispered to herself. She wasn't just leaving a cheating boyfriend. She was leaving the American dream for a Korean nightmare. She was walking away from the Southside girl and toward the girl her father had died to protect. When the doors opened at the lobby, she didn't head for the valet. She walked straight to the black sedan idling at the curb. The door was opened by a man in a black suit who didn't look at her face. He looked at her feet, bowing low. "The patriarch is waiting in New York, Gukbi," the man said. Zionne stepped into the car. Behind her, the lights of Buckhead flickered, oblivious to the fact that their world was about to be dismantled, brick by expensive brick. The transition from the humidity of Georgia to the razor-sharp winds of Manhattan felt like moving from a dream into a cold, clinical reality. 3 months had passed since the Buckhead rooftop. To the world, Zionne Vance had vanished. To the Golden Circle, she had finally come home. New York City didn't just look different, it smelled different. In Atlanta, life smelled of pine and rain. Here, it was the scent of Santal 33, expensive leather, and the metallic tang of ambition that hung over the Chelsea high-rise where Zionne now stood. She was no longer dressed in the vintage wraps of a struggling consultant. She wore a tailored Armani suit, the charcoal fabric so fine it felt like a second skin, and her hair, once loose, was now pulled back into a sleek, lethal bun. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Onyx Jade Group's headquarters, watching the tiny lights of the city below. To everyone else, this was a multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate. To the initiated, it was the beating heart of the Golden Circle, the most sophisticated Korean syndicate on the East Coast. "The tea is getting cold, Gukbi." The voice was like smoke, smooth, dark, and dangerous. Zionne didn't jump. She had learned in 90 days that in this building, silence was a predator's greatest tool. She turned slowly. Sitting behind a desk of petrified wood was Min-ho. They called him the Statue of Manhattan, and for good reason. He was a masterpiece of cold lines and sharp angles. His eyes were obsidian, reflecting nothing but the glow of his monitors, and his presence was so immense it seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. "I prefer it cold," Zionne replied, her voice steady. "It reminds me of where I came from." Min-ho leaned back, his fingers interlaced. On his pinky sat a signet ring with a jade inlay, the mark of the chairman's chosen successor. "You came from a lineage of honor, Zionne. Your father, Elias, was a man who understood that a debt of blood is the only currency that never devalues." Zionne looked away, a flicker of memory crossing her mind. Her father, a foreman on the Savannah docks, had never spoken of the night he pulled a bleeding, exiled Korean man from a shipping container and hid him from the assassins trailing him. He had simply called it doing the right thing. He died thinking he was a simple laborer. He never knew that the man he saved was the patriarch of the Golden Circle, or that the patriarch had spent 20 years waiting to repay that debt. When Zionne had walked into the Circle's Jersey City compound 3 months ago, she hadn't come as a beggar. She had come as a creditor. "The patriarch wanted to give you a pension and a quiet life in Seoul," Min-ho said, his voice dropping an octave. I told him it would be a waste of a perfectly good weapon. I'm not a weapon, Minho, Zionne said, stepping toward the desk. I'm a strategist. Your men know how to break bones, but they don't know how to break a contract. You're being squeezed in the Chelsea development project because you're fighting with muscle when you should be fighting with a scalpel. Minho finally looked at her, truly looked at her. It wasn't the look Preston used to give her, the look of a man checking his watch or admiring his own reflection in her eyes. It was the look of a wolf measuring the strength of a new member of the pack. The permits for the Sterling acquisition were denied this morning, Minho noted, a microscopic smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Preston Sterling is currently screaming at his lawyers in a boardroom 3 blocks away. He thinks it's the city council. He has no idea it's a woman he called trash. He underestimated the Southside girl, Zionne said, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. He thought my value was in the spreadsheets I built for him. He didn't realize I was the one who built the world those spreadsheets lived in. Minho stood up. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful, moving with a grace that suggested he was more comfortable in a fight than a boardroom. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. The scent of his dark cologne, something custom, with notes of oud and black pepper, filled her senses. The title of Gukbi, the national secret, is not just a name, Minho whispered, leaning in so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. It means you do not exist to the law. You do not exist to your past. You belong to the circle, and in return, the circle belongs to you. Are you ready to stop being a ghost and start being a queen? The ice in his eyes seemed to flicker for a moment. A spark of something human, and perhaps something possessive, igniting in the dark. Zionne didn't flinch. She reached out, her fingers grazing the silk of his tie, a gesture of defiance and intimacy that would have cost anyone else their life. I stopped being a ghost the night I left Atlanta, Minho. Now I'm the nightmare Preston Sterling never saw coming. Minho laughed. It was the first time she had heard it, a rare, rich sound that felt like a reward. Then let's begin. The Onyx Jade Group has a gala at the Met in 2 weeks. Preston will be there, begging for a seat at the table. I want you to be the one who pulls the chair out from under him. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a necklace of raw African emeralds, held together by silver threads that looked like spiderwebs. Wear these, he commanded. Let him see exactly what kind of leftovers he threw away. As Zionne took the box, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an alert. Preston Sterling had just filed for an emergency loan, putting up his family estate as collateral. The trap was set. Minho watched her, his expression returning to that of the statue, but his hand stayed on the desk near hers, a silent promise of the violence he was willing to unleash to protect his new secret. One more thing, Zionne, Minho added as she turned to leave. In this world, we don't just eliminate enemies, we erase them. Are you prepared to watch him lose everything? Zionne paused at the door, her silhouette framed by the glowing skyline of the city she was about to conquer. Minho, I'm from the Southside. We don't just watch the house burn. We're the ones who brought the matches. The door clicked shut, leaving Minho alone in the dark office, the shadow of the golden circle lengthening behind him. The scent of stale scotch and expensive floor wax permeated Preston Sterling's boutique office in Chelsea. It was a space designed to scream success, all minimalist glass, white marble, and original Basquiat prints. But today, it felt like a gilded cage. Preston paced the length of his hand-tufted silk rug, his jaw tight enough to snap. What do you mean the sewage permit was rescinded? Preston roared into his gold-plated iPhone. I've already poured the foundation. I have investors in Dubai expecting a progress report by Friday. On the other end of the line, a weary city official stammered something about unforeseen zoning inconsistencies and environmental impact discrepancies in the Southside corridor. Preston slammed the phone onto his desk, the vibration rattling a crystal decanter of Macallan 25. He looked out his window at the skeleton of his luxury high-rise. For weeks, every move he made was met with a wall of red tape. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a surgical strike. Every supplier, from the Italian marble vendors to the local concrete unions, had suddenly developed scheduling conflicts. He was being squeezed. The interest on his bridge loans was hemorrhaging $300,000 a day. If he didn't break ground on the upper floors by the end of the month, his creditors, including some very unfriendly men from the Philadelphia docks, would move from calling his office to visiting his home. "Who are these onyx jade people?" he hissed to his assistant, who stood trembling by the door. "I want a face. I want a name. I want to know who is buying up the air rights to my own damn building." 3 blocks away, in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the Onyx Jade Executive Suite, Zionne Vance was the picture of calm. She sat at a glass table, her fingers dancing across a sleek tablet. The screen displayed a complex web of Preston's shell companies, debt ratios, and offshore accounts. She wasn't wearing hoops today. She wore Cartier studs and a Tom Ford blazer that gave her shoulders the sharp, lethal silhouette of a bird of prey. "He's leveraged his family's Virginia estate," Zionne said, her voice cool and rhythmic. "He's desperate. He's trying to consolidate his debt into a single global growth bond. If we block that bond, the entire house of cards collapses." Min Ho stood by the window, his back to her. His charcoal suit jacket was off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, and the faint, jagged edge of a scar near his wrist, a remnant of a knife fight in the Seoul back alleys he never talked about. "You found the crack in his foundation," Min Ho said, turning to look at her. The statue was watching her with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy. His lawyers missed it, his accountants missed it. How did a girl from the Southside see it? Zionne looked up, a sharp, knowing smile touching her lips. Because in the Southside, when you build a house, you learn to look for where the termites hide before you paint the walls. Preston only looks at the paint. He thinks prestige is a shield. I know it's just a target. She tapped a final command on her screen. "I just sent a notification to the port of Savannah, a clerical error in the manifest of his imported Italian cabinetry. Those containers won't see New York for another 6 months." Min Ho walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. He stopped at the edge of the table, leaning down until his face was level with hers. The ice in his obsidian eyes was beginning to melt into something that looked dangerously like admiration. "You're more ruthless than my brother," Min Ho whispered. "He uses a gun. You use a pen. I'm not sure which one leaves a bigger mess." Are you watching Zionne dismantle a man's entire life with a single click and wondering if you have that kind of power? You do. It's called the subscribe button. Join the inner circle of my Afro-Korean boss stories now, or stay on the outside like Preston, wondering why your world is falling apart. If you're not subscribing, tell us in the comments. Are you afraid of a woman with a plan? The physical proximity was a pulse of tension that Zionne felt in her marrow. She could smell the dark cologne and the faint scent of the green tea he favoured. For a second, the strategist in her wavered. She saw the man behind the Mafia boss, the weight of the statue he had to play every day. "A gun is loud, Min Ho," Zionne said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A pen is permanent. I don't want Preston dead. I want him to watch me own everything he thought he was too good to share with me." Min Ho reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. It was a touch of possessiveness, the rare currency of a man who didn't give anything away for free. The gala at the Met is in 48 hours. He's managed to secure a ticket through a senator's daughter. He thinks he's going there to find a saviour. "He's going there to find his executioner," Zionne corrected, her eyes locking onto Min Ho's. Suddenly, Min Ho's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his expression hardened instantly, the warmth of the moment evaporating. "My brother Ji-hun is back from Philadelphia. Minho said, his voice returning to a cold, smoke-like rasp. He's asking questions about the new consultant I brought into the inner circle. He doesn't like secrets he can't control. Zionne stood up, smoothing her blazer. The micro-cliffhanger of the brothers' arrival hung in the air like a threat. Let him ask. I've handled men like your brother my whole life. They think because they can shout, they can lead. They're wrong. Minho watched her walk toward the door. Zionne, he called out. She paused. In the golden circle, the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a jealous brother. Stay close to me at the gala. Do not leave my sight. Is that an order, boss? Zionne asked, a playful but sharp edge to her tone. It's a warning, Minho replied, the shadows of the room seeming to swallow him as he turned back to the window. Zionne stepped out of the office, her mind already 3 moves ahead. She had Preston in the squeeze, but she could feel the presence of a new predator in the water. Jihan was a variable she hadn't accounted for, and in the noir luxury world of the Golden Circle, a single variable could be the difference between a crown and a grave. She took the elevator down, the silence of the building echoing her own resolve. The Southside girl was gone. The Gukbi was ready for her debut. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was not merely a museum tonight. It was a fortress of glass, history, and hyper-luxury. The global Silk Road Gala had drawn the kind of crowd that didn't just own wealth, they defined it. Outside, the Fifth Avenue air was crisp, but inside the Temple of Denda, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of Joe Malone's Oud and Bergamot, the heavy fragrance of $1,000 lilies, and the electric hum of high-stakes networking. Preston Sterling adjusted the bow tie of his Tom Ford tuxedo, his palms uncharacteristically damp. Beside him, Camille, a senator's daughter with porcelain skin and a vacant, practiced smile, adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet. To the cameras, they were the picture of New York's rising power. To Preston, Camille was a human shield, a pedigree he hoped would distract from the fact that his bank accounts were bleeding out. There, Camille whispered, nodding toward a group of elderly men in bespoke suits. That's the board of the Port Authority. You said you needed to speak with them about the Chelsea site? Later, Preston snapped, his eyes scanning the room like a hunted animal. I need to find the head of the Onyx Jade group. My sources say he's here. If I can just get 5 minutes to explain the zoning situation. Preston, you're sweating, Camille said, her voice laced with a hint of disgust. It's unbecoming. He ignored her, his gaze landing on the grand entrance. The room was a kaleidoscope of colour, vibrant saris, silk hanboks, and structural gowns. But suddenly the kaleidoscope stopped spinning. A hush rippled through the hall, starting at the heavy doors and washing over the crowd like a cold front. Minho entered first. He looked like a blade forged in shadow, wearing a tuxedo so perfectly tailored it seemed to absorb the light. His Statue of Manhattan expression was in full effect. Obsidian eyes cold, jawline set like granite. But he wasn't the reason the room had gone silent. On his arm was a woman who didn't just command attention, she demanded submission. Zionne Vance was a vision of structural black velvet that clung to her curves before flaring into a dramatic, architectural train. Around her neck sat the raw African emeralds Minho had gifted her, glowing with a deep, primordial green against her skin. But it was her hair that held the room captive, an architectural crown of braids woven with shimmering silver thread, rising like a throne above her brow. She didn't look like the woman who had spent late nights over Preston's spreadsheets. She looked like the deity those spreadsheets were meant to appease. Preston's cocktail glass tilted dangerously in his hand. Zionne, he hissed, the word catching in his throat. She didn't look at him. She navigated the room with a predator's grace. Her eyes, now sharp and predatory, scanning the elite as if she were deciding which ones to keep and which to discard. Preston stepped forward, his ego overriding his survival instinct. He shrugged off Camille's hand and intercepted them near a display of Ming Dynasty pottery. Zionne? Preston's voice was a ragged mix of disbelief and mockery. What? What kind of costume is this? Did you sneak in with the waitstaff? I know I told you to find a new job, but I didn't think you'd be serving hors d'oeuvres at the Met. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Minho didn't move toward a weapon. He didn't have to. The air around him simply turned to ice. He looked down at Preston as if he were a particularly loud insect. Zionne paused, her gaze sliding slowly toward Preston. She didn't flinch. She didn't look hurt. She looked bored. Minho leaned down, his lips brushing the silver-threaded braids near Zionne's ear. He whispered something in Korean, a low, melodic rasp that sounded like a secret and a threat all at once. Zionne's lips curved into a smile, a cold, sharp thing that didn't reach her eyes. Preston, Zionne said. Her voice didn't just carry, it echoed, commanding the attention of the surrounding donors. I see your Chelsea permits were denied again this afternoon. A shame. It turns out the city doesn't like trash cluttering up the skyline. Preston recoiled as if she had slapped him. How do you... And Camille, Zionne added, her gaze shifting to the senator's daughter with a pitying tilt of her head. I'd check those tennis bracelets if I were you. Preston's been liquidating his assets for weeks. I doubt those diamonds are more than high-grade cubic zirconia. Camille's face went pale, her hand flying to her wrist. The socialites nearby began to whisper, the sound like the rustle of dry leaves. You think this makes you someone, Preston hissed, stepping into her space, the scent of cheap desperation wafting off him. You're a fraud. You're a Southside girl playing dress-up with some Korean mobster. Minho moved then. It was a subtle shift, a step forward that placed him between Zionne and Preston, but it carried the weight of a mountain. He didn't touch Preston. He simply looked at him. You speak of value, Minho said, his voice like smoke over embers. But you are a man who cannot see the sun until it burns his eyes. This woman is the Gukbi. She is the heartbeat of my organization. And you? You are a footnote I am currently erasing. Minho reached out and plucked the half-empty cocktail from Preston's trembling hand, handed it to a passing waiter without breaking eye contact, and then placed a possessive hand on the small of Zionne's back. Shall we, my queen? Minho asked. Yes, Zionne replied, her voice smooth as silk. I find the air in this part of the room has become stagnant. As they walked away, leaving Preston standing alone in a circle of judgmental stares, the realization hit him like a physical blow. The Onyx Jade Group wasn't just a competitor. It was Zionne. The woman he had discarded in a Buckhead bar wasn't just surviving. She was holding the leash of the most dangerous man in New York, and she was currently pulling it tight around Preston's neck. In the reflection of a nearby glass case, Zionne caught Minho's eye. The physical spark was undeniable, a shared moment of triumph that felt more intimate than a touch. But as they reached the center of the hall, Zionne spotted a figure watching them from the mezzanine, a younger man with a restless, angry energy, Ji-Hoon. He wasn't looking at the art. He was looking at Zionne with a gaze that promised a different kind of war. The Knight of Emeralds was a victory, but as Zionne felt the weight of the silver thread in her hair, she knew the ice was only going to get thicker from here. The cold air of the Upper East Side hit Zionne like a physical wake-up call after the suffocating opulence of the Temple of Denda. Beside her, Minho walked in silence, his presence a heavy, dark anchor. The gala was over, but the adrenaline still hummed in Zionne's veins, a rhythmic vibration that matched the clicking of her heels on the pavement. They didn't head for the main valet. Instead, Kangdae had the black Maybach idling in a shadowed corner of the museum's private parking structure. The concrete walls echoed with the low growl of the engine. You handled him well, Minho said, his voice a low vibration in the night air. But you were reckless to mention the bonds. A cornered animal doesn't care about the beauty of the trap. It only cares about the throat of the hunter. I wanted him to feel the teeth, Zionne replied, her breath hitching in the cold. I wanted him to know exactly which brick I pulled to make his house fall. They reached the car, but before Kangdae could open the door, a figure lunged from behind a concrete pillar. Zionne! It was Preston. He had ditched his tuxedo jacket. His white shirt stained with sweat and spilled gin. His hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was a matted mess. He looked less like a real estate mogul and more like a ghost of the man he used to be. "You think you can just walk away?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking against the low ceiling. "You think you can take my company, my family's land? You're a thief. You're a Southside grifter who stole my secrets and sold them to the highest bidder." Minho didn't move. He stood like a statue, his eyes tracking Preston with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a moth fly into a flame. Preston ignored him, his eyes fixed on Zionne with a terrifying, singular focus. He stepped forward, reaching out to grab her arm. "Come back to the hotel, Zionne. We can fix this. You tell this gangster to back off, and I'll forgive you. We'll go back to Atlanta. I'll buy you a bigger ring." "Don't touch me, Preston," Zionne said, her voice like a razor. But he was past listening. He lunged, his hand clamping down hard on Zionne's wrist. It wasn't a lover's touch. It was the desperate, bruising grip of a man trying to claim a piece of property. The world seemed to slow down. Before Zionne could even draw breath to react, Minho moved. He didn't punch. He didn't kick. He moved with a terrifying, fluid efficiency. In one blur of motion, he stepped into Preston's space, his hand catching Preston's throat, while his other hand forced the man's wrist back with a sickening pop. Preston let out a strangled wail, collapsing to his knees as Minho's grip tightened. The statue was gone. In its place was something ancient and violent. Minho didn't look angry, he looked predatory. "I told you," Minho whispered, leaning over the trembling man. "I am currently erasing you, and you just gave me a reason to use a much larger eraser." He threw Preston aside like a piece of industrial waste. Preston scrambled back, whimpering, disappearing into the shadows of the garage as Kangdae stepped forward to ensure he didn't return. Minho turned to Zionne. His eyes were no longer obsidian. They were burning. He didn't ask if she was okay. He reached out and took her hand, lifting her wrist into the light of the overhead fluorescent bulb. A red blooming mark was already starting to darken where Preston's fingers had been. Minho's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He traced the edge of the bruise with the pad of his thumb, a touch so light it was almost a ghost. "Who did this to you?" he asked. The question was absurd. They both knew who had done it, but the tone wasn't a question. It was a vow. It was the "who did this to you" protocol of a man who viewed her safety as a holy mandate. "I'm fine, Minho," Zionne whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's just a mark." "It is a debt," Minho corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive rasp. "And in my world, we collect on every debt." He led her into the back of the Maybach. The door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud, sealing them into a world of leather and silence. The interior smelled of dark tobacco and the faint, lingering scent of Zionne's emeralds. As the car glided out into the New York night, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of two business partners. It was the pulse of a shared intimacy. Minho didn't let go of her hand. He kept her wrist resting on his knee, his thumb still tracing the bruise. "My father used to say that a man who hits a woman is a man who has already lost the war," Minho said, looking out the window at the passing lights of Times Square. "He was a violent man, Zionne. He built this empire on bones, but he never touched my mother. He told me that a queen's skin is the border of her kingdom. To mark it is to declare war on the crown." Zionne looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the ice melting. She saw the vulnerability he hid beneath the charcoal suits and the petrified wood desks. "Is that why you saved me?" she asked. "Because of your father's code?" Minho turned his head, his face inches from hers. The light from the street lamps flickered across his features, highlighting the intensity in his gaze. I saved you because I have spent 10 years surrounded by people who want something from me, he whispered. You are the only person who offered me something I didn't know I lacked. And what's that? A mirror, he said. One that doesn't show a statue. It shows a man. He leaned in, the physical spark between them finally igniting. His breath was warm against her lips, a stark contrast to the cold steel of his reputation. For a second, Zionne forgot about the permits, the bonds and the revenge. She forgot about the Southside girl and the Gukbi. But just as the gap between them closed, his phone buzzed. Not a call, an alert. Minho pulled back, the ice slamming back into place instantly. He looked at the screen. His face went pale, a rare, terrifying sight. What is it? Zionne asked, her voice trembling. My brother, Minho said, his voice like smoke. Ji-hun didn't go back to the hotel. He's headed to Philadelphia. He's found out about Preston's family estate. The moment was gone. The thaw was over. The war had just moved to a new front, and Zionne realized that the red mark on her wrist was only the beginning of the blood that was about to be spilled. The Delaware River looked like liquid lead under the flickering amber lights of the Benjamin Franklin Bridge. Across the water, Philadelphia's skyline hummed with life. But here in Camden, the air tasted of salt, rust, and the metallic tang of industrial oil. Preston Sterling stood in the center of a derelict warehouse, his breathing shallow and jagged. The Tom Ford tuxedo he had worn to the Met was now ruined, the silk stained with the grime of the shipping docks. In his hand, he clutched a heavy, rusted iron pry bar. Behind him stood 4 men in tactical gear, local enforcers he had hired with the last of his liquid cash. Is it here? Preston hissed, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. Crate 409, marked with the onyx jade seal, one of the men growled, his face obscured by a dark gaiter. He pointed to a single wooden crate sitting beneath a buzzing halogen light. Your tip was right. It came off the Savannah freighter an hour ago. If this is the national secret's leverage, you've got her by the throat. Preston felt a surge of manic energy. He had been a king in Buckhead. He had been a god in Chelsea. He refused to be a footnote in Zionne Vance's revenge story. He had spent the last 24 hours following a breadcrumb trail of encrypted messages sent from an anonymous source, someone who clearly wanted Zionne and Minho to fall as much as he did. Open it, Preston commanded. As the men jammed their tools into the wood, the heavy steel doors of the warehouse groaned open. The sound was like a gunshot in the hollow space. Minho stepped into the light first. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He wore a black tactical turtleneck and a long dark overcoat that billowed behind him like a shroud. Behind him, Zionne walked with a slow, deliberate cadence. She was dressed in leather leggings and a structured trench coat, her Southside gold hoops catching the harsh light. She didn't look afraid. She looked disappointed. Preston, Zionne said, her voice cutting through the damp air. I see you've traded the boardroom for a junkyard. It's a fitting lateral move. Shut up, Preston screamed, gesturing wildly with the pry bar. I have it, Zionne. Whatever contraband you and your Korean boyfriend are using to fund your little takeover, it's in this box. I have the leverage now. You're going to call off the debt collectors. You're going to give me back the Chelsea permits, or I'll call every federal agent from here to DC. Minho stopped 10 feet away. His expression was the statue at its most terrifying, utterly devoid of heat. You believe you have leverage because someone gave it to you, Preston. In my world, a gift from an enemy is just a decorated grave. Suddenly, a third shadow detached itself from the rafters. A younger man, lean and kinetic, dropped from the catwalk with the grace of a cat. It was Ji-hun, Minho's brother. He looked at Zionne with a sneer of pure contempt. He's right, brother, Ji-hun said, circling the group. I gave the American the tip. I wanted to see if your Gukbi was truly as smart as you claim. But look at her. She walked right into a warehouse full of armed men just to protect a crate of ghost paper. Minho didn't look at his brother. He kept his obsidian eyes locked on Zionne. Did she? Zionne stepped forward, stepping over a puddle of black oil that looked like a mirror of the night sky. She looked at the 4 enforcers Preston had hired. She didn't say a word. She simply made a sharp, clicking sound with her tongue. In an instant, the 4 men dropped their weapons. They didn't point their guns at Zionne or Minho. Instead, they turned and pointed them directly at Preston and Ji-hun. The silence that followed was deafening. What are you doing?" Preston stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. "I paid you. I gave you 50,000. "You gave them a down payment on their loyalty," Zionne said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "But they don't work for mercenaries, Preston. They are Golden Circle soldiers. They've been on my payroll since the moment you stepped foot in Philadelphia." Ji-hun's sneer evaporated. "Brother, what is this?" "This," Minho said, finally turning to his brother, "is the difference between a child playing with matches and a queen who owns the fire." Zionne walked up to the crate 409. With a flick of her wrist, she kicked the loosened lid aside. Preston leaned forward, expecting to see stacks of cash, kilos of narcotics, or the encrypted servers of the Onyx Jade Group. Instead, the crate was empty, save for a single small object resting in the centre of the straw. It was a framed photograph. Preston leaned in closer. His heart stopped. It was the photo from the Buckhead rooftop bar. It captured the exact second he had laughed in Zionne's face, his mouth open in a jagged sneer, while she stood there with a look of quiet, unbreakable dignity. "You called me trash because you couldn't handle the value I brought to your life," Zionne said, her voice echoing off the steel beams. "In my world, we don't throw away things of value. We eliminate the things that diminish it." Preston began to tremble. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been lured here. Every message from Ji-hun, every leak, every opportunity to steal the shipment had been orchestrated by Zionne. She hadn't just beaten him. She had choreographed his descent. "Zionne, please," Preston whispered, his knees buckling. "We have history. You loved me. I was stressed. I didn't mean those things." Minho stepped closer to Zionne, his hand resting on the small of her back, a gesture of possessiveness that felt like a death sentence for Preston. "He still speaks of love," Minho said to Zionne, his voice like smoke. "Should I cut out his tongue so he can no longer insult the word?" Zionne looked at Preston, really looked at him, and saw nothing but a hollow man in a ruined suit. "No, Minho. A man like Preston doesn't need to be silenced. He needs to be forgotten." She reached into her trench coat and pulled out the sleek, black fountain pen, the one Preston used to sign her dismissal papers months ago. She tossed it onto the empty crate. "The enforcers will take you to the docks, Preston," Zionne said. "You're going to sign the final forfeiture of your family estate, and then you're going to disappear. If I ever see your face in this hemisphere again, I won't send soldiers. I'll come myself." As the guards grabbed a sobbing Preston, Zionne turned to Ji-hun. The younger brother was frozen, realized he had been outplayed by the outsider he despised. "And you," Zionne said to Ji-hun, "next time you try to set a trap for the Queen, make sure you aren't the bait." The micro-cliffhanger of the brothers' betrayal had been resolved, but the tension in the room shifted as Zionne's phone buzzed in the heavy silence. She pulled it out, her face going pale as she read the screen. Minho saw the change. The ice returned to his eyes. "What is it?" Zionne didn't answer. She just showed him the screen. A message from an unknown number in Seoul. "The Queen has a crown, but the King has a wife. I'm landing at JFK in an hour." The warehouse felt colder than ever. Zionne looked at Minho, waiting for a denial, a lie, anything. But the Mafia boss avoided her gaze, his silhouette casting a long, dark shadow over the empty crate. The air in the Camden warehouse had turned from industrial chill to a suffocating atmospheric pressure. The buzzing halogen light above crate 409 flickered, casting rhythmic shadows across Zionne's face. She held the phone like a live grenade, the glowing text of the message from Seoul searing into her retinas. The king has a wife. Minho remained a statue, but the granite was cracking. He didn't look at the phone. He looked at the dark corners of the warehouse, his jaw set so tight the bone seemed ready to burst through his skin. "Zionne," he began, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "Don't," she interrupted, the word sharp as a shard of glass. "Don't use my name while you're standing in the wreckage of a lie, Minho." Beside them, the Golden Circle soldiers held Preston Sterling by his collar. Preston, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, looked between Zionne's pale face and Minho's rigid posture. A pathetic, hysterical laugh bubbled up from his throat. "Oh, this is rich," Preston wheezed, his eyes wide with desperate glee. "The national secret didn't know the secret? You thought you were the only one, Zionne? You really thought a man like him, a man with a throne to protect, would choose a girl from the Southside over a blood alliance?" Minho's hand twitched toward his coat, a silent promise of violence, but Zionne stepped forward first. She didn't look at Minho. She looked at Preston. Her fear had evaporated, replaced by a cold, concentrated rage that made the Southside grit feel like a tactical weapon. "Sign the papers, Preston," she commanded. Her voice was devoid of emotion, a flat, lethal monotone. One of the soldiers slammed a heavy, leather-bound folder onto the top of the wooden crate. Inside was the deed to the Sterling family estate in Virginia, the ancestral home, the rolling hills, the only thing Preston actually valued more than his own skin. Preston looked at the black fountain pen Zionne had tossed onto the straw. "If I sign this, I have nothing. I'm a ghost." "If you don't sign it," Zionne said, leaning in until her gold hoops brushed against the side of his head, "you won't be a ghost. You'll be a memory. Minho might be a liar, but he's still the man who controls the ports. Do you want to find out what happens to trash that gets caught in his gears?" Preston looked at Minho, who was watching him with the eyes of a man who had already decided on a sentence. With a trembling hand, Preston reached for the pen. The scratch of the nib against the parchment was the only sound in the cavernous space. Preston Sterling. The signature was shaky, a jagged scar on a legal document. "It's done," the soldier muttered, pulling the folder away. Zionne took the folder. She didn't feel the triumph she had expected. She felt heavy. She turned to Minho, the man who had called her a mirror, a queen, a partner. "Is it true?" she asked. "The wife, the landing at JFK?" Minho finally met her gaze. The ice was there, but behind it was a profound, suffocating grief. "It is an arrangement, a treaty between the Golden Circle and the Busan clan. My father signed it when I was 10 years old. It was never a choice." "Everything is a choice, Minho," Zionne said. She felt the physical spark that had ignited in the Maybach die a cold, silent death. "You chose to let me believe I was the only one on that throne. You chose to weaponize my loyalty while hiding the chain around your own neck. Zionne, the Busan clan is arriving to finalize the merger. If they suspect you are anything more than a consultant, they will eliminate you before I can draw a breath to stop them." Minho stepped toward her, his hand reaching out, but she recoiled as if his touch were acid. "I'm not a consultant," Zionne spat, "and I'm not a victim. You told me I was the Gukbi, the national secret. Well, here's a secret for you, boss. I don't play for second place." She turned to the soldiers. "Take Preston to the terminal. Make sure he's on a flight to nowhere. And Kangdae?" The silent enforcer stepped out of the shadows, bowing his head to her. "The folder stays with me," Zionne said. "I am the owner of the Sterling estate now. Not the Onyx Jade Group, not the Golden Circle. Me." Minho's eyes widened. "Zionne, that property is part of the merger collateral. Then I guess the merger just hit a very expensive snag." she replied. She walked toward the exit, her structural trench coat fluttering like wings. The tension is high enough to draw blood, yet you're still not a subscriber. Do you enjoy being an outsider to the inner circle? Subscribe to my Afro-Korean boss stories now to see how a real queen handles her business, or explain in the comments why you're choosing to walk away from the throne. As she reached the heavy steel doors, she paused. She didn't look back. You told me the queen's skin is the border of her kingdom, Minho. You marked me with a lie. That's an act of war. She stepped out into the Camden night, the rain beginning to fall in fat, heavy drops. Behind her, she heard the sound of a glass bottle shattering against the warehouse floor. Minho's only outburst of emotion. She climbed into a separate car, one she had arranged through her own contacts in the Savannah ports weeks ago. She didn't head for the hotel. She didn't head for the penthouse. "Where to, Gukbi?" the driver asked. Zionne looked at the folder in her lap, then at the notification on her phone. The secret wife was landing. The statue was compromised, and Zionne Vance was no longer a placeholder. "JFK," Zionne said, her voice like cold steel. "If the king has a wife, it's time she meets the woman who owns his empire." The car roared to life, leaving the warehouse and the broken boss behind. The catharsis of Preston's defeat was gone, replaced by the awe of a new, much more dangerous game. The arrivals terminal at JFK was a cathedral of glass and cold fluorescent light. It smelled of jet fuel, floor wax, and the restless energy of 1,000 lives in transit. Zionne stood near the international gate, a solitary figure in her black trench coat. She didn't hide in the shadows. She stood directly under the lights, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the sliding doors. In her hand, she clutched the folder containing Preston's forfeited estate. It was her armour, her leverage. The doors hissed open. A group of men in charcoal suits, identical to Minho's, emerged first. They moved with a synchronized military precision that signaled the arrival of royalty. And then she appeared. Soo-jin of the Busan clan didn't walk. She glided. She was draped in a cream-coloured cashmere coat that looked like fallen snow, her hair a sharp, dark bob that framed a face of terrifying, doll-like perfection. She stopped 10 feet from Zionne, her eyes, feline and discerning, swept over Zionne's gold hoops and the raw emerald still visible at her throat. "You must be the Gukbi," Soo-jin said. Her English was flawless, sharpened by years of Swiss boarding schools. "The national secret that my husband-to-be has been hiding in his boardroom." "I'm Zionne Vance," Zionne replied, her voice steady, "and I don't hide." Soo-jin stepped closer, the scent of a rare, powdery orchid perfume filling the space between them. "Minho has a penchant for American grit. He thinks it adds flavour to the business. But flavour is for appetizers, Miss Vance. I am the main course. I am the treaty that keeps the Golden Circle from being dismantled by the authorities in Seoul." "A treaty is just a piece of paper," Zionne said, lifting the folder, "and I happen to own the paper that controls the ground beneath Minho's feet. If you want the merger to go through, you don't talk to the king. You talk to me." Soo-jin's expression didn't flicker, but the air around her turned noticeably colder. "You are bold. I see why he was distracted. But a girl from the Southside should know better than to touch a crown that doesn't belong to her." "The crown didn't fit him anyway," Zionne countered. "It was too heavy for a man who can't tell the truth." Just then, the screech of tires echoed through the terminal's pickup lane. Minho burst through the entrance, his coat flying, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He stopped when he saw them. The two women in his life, standing like opposing generals on a battlefield of his own making. He looked at Soo-jin with duty. He looked at Zionne with a desperate, scorched earth longing. "Soo-jin," Minho said, his voice a ghost of its former power. "You're late, Minho," Soo-jin said, not looking at him. Her eyes remained locked on Zionne. "And you've left your business unattended. Miss Vance was just explaining how she's hijacked our collateral. Zionne locked eyes with Minho. She saw the statue try to reform, saw the ice try to settle, but it was too late. The mirror was shattered. She turned her back on both of them, walking toward the exit where the rain was still washing the New York streets clean. "Zionne!" Minho called out, his voice cracking the silence of the terminal. She didn't stop. She had conquered Preston. She had outplayed Ji-hun. And now she was stepping into a war with a woman who had 1,000 years of clan history behind her. She wasn't a ghost, a placeholder, or a secret anymore. She was the variable that would bring the golden circle to its knees. The screen fades to black as Zionne steps into the rain, the lights of the city reflecting in her eyes like a fire that refuses to be put out. If you aren't subscribed to my Afro-Korean boss stories, you're already behind on the most dangerous love triangle of 2026. Subscribe now, or tell us in the comments why you're choosing to stay in the dark. Next time on my Afro-Korean boss stories, Soo-jin makes an offer Zionne can't refuse, and Minho is forced to choose between his bloodline and the woman who owns his soul. You won't want to miss The Empress's Gambit. See you in the next story.